Who's ever read the classic War and Peace? Nobody read it? You tried? You tried. Well done. Have you listened to it on audiobook, perhaps? I've done that much, at least. Yes? No. It's a long one. It's a byword for a long read. And if you can't get to sleep at night, I recommend you try it. Particularly the kind of language that's used in it from the 1800s, it can be, yes, quite difficult to penetrate. It's a story, of course, by Leo Tolstoy, based in Russia, long after this church was built. So this church has seen all the events, or the time period that the events were written of, and the writing of it, when France invaded Russia in the early 1800s. It was dramatized on TV just last year by Andrew Davies, who was also the writer of TV versions of Dr. Zhivago and Pride and Prejudice. So it's got a bit of a pedigree there. War and peace is interwoven with life. And you see it in the history of every single last country on this planet. I'm guessing we'd rather see a little less war, if not a lot less war, and certainly a whole lot more peace. This morning in our reading from Exodus 14, we read of a war, just one war. The Israelites are escaping Egypt, and the Egyptians are chasing after them. And the Israelites, unsurprisingly, at the end of all those events, are awestruck that God has managed to save them from their enemies. And it isn't too long before they start gloating a little bit about it. They raise up songs about what has taken place, but they give glory to God for their escape from that situation and for their lives being spared. And perhaps that's nothing that we wouldn't do ourselves. If we found ourselves in circumstances like that, or any circumstances of war for that matter, fleeing from armed forces, and this is a very current topic in many ways, isn't it? Fleeing from armed forces, wouldn't we give praise to God if we had some kind of miraculous escape that we just thought we weren't going to get out of? And then perhaps if we saw the end of our enemies, a little bit of a gloating? Maybe I. How that contrasts with the themes of peace and forgiveness that we read in Matthew 18. We'll come back to that shortly. In a couple of months, we're going to consider World War I with our Remembrance Sunday events in November. But slightly more recent events are within the living memory of some here today. World War II. It started in September the 1st, 1939, all the way through to May 1945. The Dunkirk evacuation, which again has been dramatized in film just recently, took place from the 26th of May to the 4th of June in 1940. On the 18th of June, Churchill gave his finest hour speech. What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuation of our institutions and empire, and so on. Little would he know that just a few days later, just the next month, the Battle of Britain, so named, would begin in the skies. Come back to that in just a second. You may recall in the summer I mentioned that I'd been to Jersey and noted some of the points about the Jersey occupation. Later that month, after Winston Churchill's speech, he spoke on the 18th of June 1940. By the 30th, Jersey was occupied. By the 10th of July, the Battle of Britain was engaged, and it continued on for a number of months to the end of October. It overlapped with the Blitz, which started on the 7th of September of that year and continued on into the next year, into May of the following year. But the Battle of Britain, which we're commemorating today and thinking about today, was the first military campaign that was fought entirely in the air. Entirely in the air. I've spoken to some in this congregation and in surrounding areas and in times past who witnessed fires in Glasgow, or who were part of teams of firefighters here in Hamilton during the war years. These are not distant events. They are events in the living memory, including those of some of us perhaps here this morning. Can I ask just a quick show of hands, who remembers any of the events of World War II? I was a bit young, I'm afraid. Yep, you remember some of those events? Thank you. Would you like to share any of them? I know that's a little bit more nerve-wracking. George, where's he gone? I've forgotten where he sat. He's over there. George, could you grab a microphone for us from Alan? A show of hands, if you wouldn't mind, please, just sharing any memory you have of those war years. And I really would encourage you to do it, not least because there might be others that haven't heard those stories. They are stories that ought to be preserved generation by generation by generation. So who has a story? Morag. Sorry, Morag. Nessie. Sorry, we get them in the end.
I remember being a little girl and being told to go under the table. And I was under the table with my big sister and a cousin. And this was to save us, or help to save us, when the bombs were dropping.
Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, sorry, Craig.
I keep in mind when I was in Lark Hall, that's where I lived with my mother and father, and we could hear the bombs dropping, and my mother was up at the window with the flashing and everything, even in Lark Hall. Also, my father, when he was working, he worked in various jobs and that, and he was on a bus once, and whatever happened, he got away from the bus and come home, but he found out later that that bus had been bombed and the people that he knew had passed away.
Anybody else? Dan, at the back. Oh, sorry, we've got... Thank you. Thank you, Regina.
We lived in the countryside out in Stirlingshire. I was just a little girl. I was in bed, supposedly going off to sleep. And I remember the sound of the planes. The engines were different. And they went on, and they went on, and they went on. And my mum came through, and she said, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. These are just bad people. And that was the start of the Clydebank Blitz that night.
Thank you. Dan up at the back.
During the war, my father was in the ARP, and as soon as the alarm went, he had to go out on duty, and we had shelters at the end of our buildings. My mother wouldn't let me go, and she stayed as well. One night my father came back, and he told the story about this man who was on duty with him. He couldn't find his helmet, so he had a frying pan in his head.
Thanks for that. Slightly lighter moment, yeah. What about those who might have been involved in the armed forces? Not necessarily during the war, perhaps during the war, but Tom. I should ask probably name, rank, and serial number, sir, shouldn't I? But I'll not be to that.
At very short notice, I haven't prepared anything at all, but I'd just like to bring back some memories that I have. In 1940, February 1940, I joined the first merchant ship that I took part in during the war. And at that particular time, the ship was anchored in the River Thames, opposite Erith. And there was quite a lot of air activity going on at that particular time, and there were both German and British planes being shot down. And when one looks at what was happening at that time, was the start of a very bad period for the British Isles as a whole, and we depended on a few people to protect us from the strength that the Germans had at that particular time. One of the things that sticks in my mind from last week in the Herald, there was an obituary to a retired squadron leader who was 99. And he was the last surviving member of the Glasgow 605 squadron who took part in the Battle of Britain. And it made interesting reading. But looking back further during the war period, we in this country went through a lot of difficult periods. We had the Dunkirk situation, the Normandy situation, the boys out in the deserts and all the rest of it. And in addition to that, there were problems with the Navy out in the Atlantic and in the Russian convoys. We also had problems out in Japan with the Burma campaign. And looking at things today, the Burma Star Standard for the Lanarkshire branch, of which I was involved in for many years, is laid up in this church. And the colours are green and gold, and the green and gold are here. The green representing the jungle, and the gold, the pagodas that were there. These were our colours, still are. And our last hymn today is 260, and it ends up and it asks for praise for those in peril on the sea. So we've got a cover for the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy, who all took part. But one has to remember too the civilians who had to put up with all the trauma, bombings and other difficulties with foodstuffs and all these sorts of things. And we tend to forget these. I don't forget them. Thank you very much.
So easy to forget that the Luftwaffe was targeting particularly our boats and our ports so that we wouldn't have food coming into the country and other imports into the country, because the Germans expected at that time that if they could cut off those supplies, we would fall to our knees as a country. And of course our own squadrons, air squadrons, were able to repel those particular armies of the Luftwaffe at that time. So that's one of the key events about the Battle of Britain. And thank you for those comments, Tom. That's very much appreciated. Any other comments? Oh, there's a hand up at the back. I'm not seeing. Where is it? Yep, sorry, yes, Jim? Gordon?
I remember this fairly clearly, although I was quite a young man at the time. It was to do with Aunt Maggie and Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe was not quite the full shilling, and Aunt Maggie wasn't that great either, but Uncle Joe went off and worked on the port itself, and we got a phone call to say that there was a particular problem down there and we should go and see what we could do about it. We went and got a taxi, which cost us £5, which about the equivalent of about £100 now, and went down to see them. And I remember going down, and on the left-hand side, there were bunkers which were firing into the sky, and the Luftwaffe was coming over. And their methodology was, first of all, to bomb flat anything which would be likely to be of useful to the Allies, and that was particularly the docks. And subsequent to that, they had high explosives, and then they came in with incendiaries. So once you had destroyed the fire areas and that sort of thing, the actual conflagration was very great, and a great many of them were lost at that time. And I remember coming back up from that And subsequently, we were living in, we had just come in, we were living just in the bottom of Hamilton. But Uncle Joe and Aunt Maggie turned up, and they had survived. And I do remember the relief of that in the family, that it was so. My memory is that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's one thing that war stories very often seem to be full of. It is escapes, isn't it? And for the various forces as well. To actually escape with life and limb is such a privilege, and something perhaps that's never underestimated for those who've experienced what could have been loss of life. Any other comments? Jim.
I remember a bomb fell at Beacott Cross. I don't know if it was a bomb or a landmine, but it created a huge hole outside what we remember as the post office. And they ringed it off, and it was a great danger, and we couldn't get up here quick enough to see the damage. But it was the only bomb that fell round about here.
Thank you for that. So, near at home as well. Very near at home. Thank you, George. Thank you for all your various comments there. That's appreciated. How do you get over that? When you reach peacetime, after coming through a time of fear, a time of concern like that, how do you get over it? Do old animosities continue? For the longest of time, particularly in the European Union, Germany and Britain have actually been at some kind of a friendship, maybe uneasy at times, but nonetheless some sort of a friendship. They import one another's goods. Maybe there's some of that's resurged a bit with Brexit recently, and I don't want to go into the politics of that, but how do we go on when it comes to these kind of animosities? War and duty are one thing, and admirable. But what about in peacetime? Is forgiveness also something that's admirable? Some situations perhaps are very difficult to forgive indeed, but are there situations that we can forgive, perhaps for more youthful or newer generations? And this, at the Congregation Bible Study this week, we asked, can we forgive and forget? Sometimes there's wisdom in remembering, and that it stops you being made a fool. But forgiveness is essential. Wars, of course, are fought on all sorts of different fronts. They're even fought within families. But there comes a point where peace must reign for the sake of everyone's health. There's a spiritual dimension to it too. Did you notice as we read Matthew chapter 18, these concluding words in verse 35, where Jesus himself concluded that particular sermon by saying, "This is how my Father in heaven will treat every one of you, unless you forgive your brother from your heart." Which begs the question to us, can we forgive? Can we forgive 70 times 7, time without number? Not just in things of history, but even things of present. Are we marked as being forgiving people? Amen.